At this point, you should all understand the basics of how the camera works, and we just showed you how to control each of the exposure-related functions, our aperture, our shutter speed, and our ISO. Now, what we want to do in this video is give you all a real-world analogy or a real-world demonstration on how the exposure triangle works, and mainly basically how the aperture, our shutter speed, and ISO work in conjunction to get to the right exposure and how each of these things affect each other. Now, what we have here is a little demonstration, and we have cups labeled ISO 100, 200, and 400, and actually, I don't know if this is a real-world analogy because I don't know who does this in the real world, but it is going to be a good visual example of each of these components and how they relate to each other. Now, before continuing, what I want to tell you all is when you think of these three components, our shutter speed, our aperture, and our ISO, I want you to think of each of these pieces in the exposure triangle as having both an exposure-related control and also an artistic-related control. We're going to talk about that in this video, so let's start from the top with our shutter speed. Now, if you remember from before, if I pop this lens off of my Canon, which again, do not do this at home, I can flip the mirror up and we can see the shutter door right underneath the mirror. Now, the shutter is what controls the duration that light is going to be reaching the sensor, so the amount of time. This can generally be measured in fractions of a second, so 1/500th of a second, 1/200th of a second, and so forth. We can even go to the other side where we're measuring in whole seconds, so 1 second, 2 seconds, 10 seconds. We can even go to minutes for what we refer to as shutter drags when we're trying to create really artistic, long, dragged out kind of effects in these images. So the artistic related component is basically in whether we choose to freeze motion or show motion. The faster the shutter speed at higher numbers, say 1/500th, 1/1000th of a second, we're going to be freezing the motion in our images. While the slower shutter speed on the shutter drag side, we're going to be showing the motion. So that's the artistic component of shutter speed. Now let's focus on the exposure component of shutter speed. So we have our cups here, ISO 100, ISO 200, and ISO 400. We're going to get to the ISOs in just 1 minute. We'll talk about that in a second. For now, let's use the ISO 100 cup, but what I want you all to realize is that these three cups, they represent the exact same desired exposure. And to get to that exposure, we need to fill the cup with light, which in this case is going to be water, and we need to get up to that top line on each of these cups, okay? So let's go ahead and grab our ISO 100 cup. I'm going to get my phone out and we're going to just open up the faucet. So this is the amount of light that we have coming out is our water. All right, we're going to time how long it takes to get to a proper exposure with this amount of light coming out. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and just use my phone and we're gonna start the stopwatch as soon as we bring it under the water now. Now, you can see that the light is coming out at a fairly slow pace right now, so it's gonna affect the duration. We're gonna have a longer duration here. So to get to the top, we need roughly 12 seconds, okay? So I'm gonna go ahead and just set this down now. So that represents our shutter speed, and you can see right here. So to get our ISO 100 cup to our desired exposure, we needed the faucet to be open for 12 seconds. That duration of time is our shutter speed, and of course, we're gonna be rounding these to the nearest whole number because, well, this is not a very exact way of measuring. Let's move on now and discuss the aperture, and to demonstrate that, I have a really cool lens I wanted to show you all. On modern DSLRs, we're actually controlling the aperture digitally through the camera itself, but this is an old film manual aperture lens. And so we're actually controlling the aperture manually with an aperture ring. The aperture is the eye, or more specifically, the pupil of our lens, which controls the amount of light that reaches the sensor at any one point in time. Now here on my manual aperture lens, I'm set to f3.5. This is the widest this aperture can get. It's the most open. And at this point, we're gonna be allowing in more light than if I were to stop it down. So for example, as I go to f5.6, the aperture shrinks up a little bit. f8, it shrinks again. f11, f16, 22, and 32. Each one of these stops down reduces the amount of light, and you can see that as the aperture opening closes up. Now, the numbering system for the aperture is a little bit counterintuitive. After all, with shutter speed and with ISO, well, we basically just double or half the number. Why do we have these weird numbers with the aperture, and why is it basically getting smaller as we go higher up in the number? Well, first, you need to realize that the aperture is actually a fractional measurement. So it's not actually f3.5, it's 1 over 3.5. And it's not f4, it's 1 over 4. And it's 1 over 11. And you know that when you go up in fractions, if that bottom number is larger, you're actually having a smaller number there. So f2 is a larger opening than f4 because that's 1 over 2, which is 1/2, and 1 over 4, which is going to be smaller. We'll talk about this in more detail as we keep going, but that is the exposure function of the aperture, controlling the amount of light coming in at one point in time. What about the artistic component? Well, the artistic component of the aperture is in controlling the depth of field. The lower the aperture number, so as I go back down to f3.5, we're essentially decreasing our depth of field. Now what this means is that anything that's behind the area that we're focusing is going to get blurred out, or it'll fall into bokeh, as we refer to. So that's that kind of pleasing background aesthetic of the blurred out area that's out of focus. As we stop down the aperture to these higher numbers, so f22 and f32, then we're increasing the depth of field, and so we get more area in our image in focus. So that's basically the artistic side of controlling the aperture. All right, so let's get back to our faucet analogy. Now, what would the aperture be in our faucet? Well, the aperture is essentially that inside component that controls the amount of water coming out. So as we bring the faucet handle up, that opening is larger. This would represent a large aperture, say f2 or f2.8. And this is the maximum amount of light that we can allow through the faucet. All right, so this is our widest open aperture. Now, as I stop it down, that opening, allowing the water through, is starting to close down. We're allowing less and less light through, and we get down to no light. So that's our aperture in our faucet. Now let's go ahead and go back to our ISO 100 cup. I'm gonna dump this out. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna open up our aperture or open up the faucet all the way, and we're gonna see how that affects our shutter speed. Because the first time we did this, we didn't have the faucet open all the way. So let's go back to our little timer right here. I'm gonna open this all the way. We have the max amount of light coming through. Let's go ahead and measure the amount of time it takes now. So I'm gonna hit start. You can see it filling much faster to our desired exposure, and right there. Okay. Okay, so to get to the same desired exposure with the sink open all the way, now we only need a 6-second shutter duration. So it looks like we actually allowed double the amount of water in by opening the faucet up all the way. This would represent 1 stop brighter in your aperture. And we're going to talk about stops in just a second. It's just a simple term, but just know that we doubled the amount of water coming through, which allowed us to cut the shutter speed in half to 6 seconds. Okay, so that is our exposure component of our aperture, and we now need to jump into ISO. Now the ISO represents a measurement of the sensitivity of light of our sensor if we're talking about a digital camera, or of our film if we're talking about film cameras. But what does that exactly mean? Well, essentially what we're saying is that if you increase the sensitivity of the sensor itself to light, then that means you need less light to get to the exact same exposure. And that's what we have here. So remember when we talked about this first, we said that each of these cups represented the exact same desired exposure. That's because at ISO 100, we need this much water, and this happens to be a 32-ounce cup. So we need 32 ounces of water to get to that correct exposure, or 32 ounces of light. That really doesn't make sense. But that's how much light we need. Now at ISO 200, we're at double the sensitivity of ISO 100. So we need half the amount of light. So in this case, we would only need 16 ounces of water, or 16 ounces of light, to get to the same desired exposure. At ISO 400, again, we've doubled the sensitivity from ISO 200. So now we need half of ISO 200's amount of water to get to the exact same desired exposure. That is the exposure side of ISO. But what about the artistic side? Okay, so the artistic side is a little bit different when we talk about ISO, because any step up that you go in ISO is going to reduce overall image quality. Essentially, a step up to ISO 200 or ISO 400 or ISO 800, each step up is going to reduce overall dynamic range, it's going to reduce color, it's going to introduce grain and noise, which will kill your detail and so forth. So in general, I would say that the goal is going to be to maximize the quality of your images. And some of you might be thinking, well, if I want to achieve that filmic look, why not go outside in the middle of the day and shoot ISO 1600 just so I have some grain and I have less color and so it looks more filmic? Well, there's a problem with that. We can actually create filmic looks in post-production fairly easily. But the problem is that if you go out and you shoot at ISO 1600 in the middle of the day, well, that's the way the images are going to be. It's only going to be at that quality level regardless. You can't ever go back and undo that. So if we shoot that way strictly for the purpose of getting that filmic look, then if we ever wanted those images to essentially be that full quality and be full sharpness and have the best color and so forth, we wouldn't be able to go back and make that adjustment. Whereas if we always shoot at the lowest possible native or the lowest possible ISO, we can always go in post-production and we can add noise and grain to create those filmic looks that we want. So save those types of things for post-production. What I would say is, as a general rule, shoot at the lowest possible ISO to get your desired exposure, or to get the settings that you need in camera to get the exposure you want. and then make any other changes in post-production to get those kind of filmic effects and so forth. Now, let's go back to our analogy here. What we're gonna do is just open up the faucet all the way. I want to demonstrate basically how these different ISO settings are going to affect our overall exposure and our shutter speed. Okay, so let's go ahead and dump this cup out. We're going to open up the aperture of our faucet all the way, so we're allowing in the maximum amount of light, which in this case is water. Let's get our little phone here and we're going to start measuring. Okay, so we had 6 seconds before. I'm just going to double check to make sure that's right. So go ahead, we're going to start. We should get to about 6 seconds to get to a proper exposure with our ISO 100. Okay, I went a little bit over, but that's all right. We're at 6.7 seconds, so close enough. So we're gonna say 6 seconds is gonna be our correct shutter speed to get our ISO 100 cup full to our desired exposure. Let's check out the ISO 200 cup. So now we only need half the amount of light, so we should need 3 seconds shutter speed. Start, let's see, and stop. Look at that. I just want to show this to you all. Can you see that? 3.06 seconds. So exactly half the shutter speed of ISO 100. Okay, let's go ahead to our ISO 400. Now we need half the amount of light from ISO 200. So this should be 1.5 seconds. So start, stop. So our final time with our ISO 400 cup was 1.28 seconds. I probably hit the stop button a little bit too quick. For the sake of argument, we're going to say 1.5 seconds. So I'm going to go ahead and close our faucet or our aperture now. Now what you saw here was that the ISO sensitivity allowed us to manipulate the shutter speed. And in this situation, we're manipulating shutter speed, but in other situations, you might use it to manipulate the aperture. It doesn't matter. But let's say, for example, that this was a case of we're shooting, say, a runner or an athlete. And as we're shooting that athlete, we notice that we're at 1/100th of a second for our shutter speed. But at 1/100th of a second, we're not freezing the motion enough. So the runner's just a little bit too blurry. So what we need to do is double the shutter speed. But let's say, for example, that our aperture is fixed at f2.8. We can't go any wider because the lens won't allow us to. So this is the maximum amount of light we can get in the lens. We're at ISO 100, and at this point, the only option we have is to increase the ISO speed, to increase the sensitivity from 100 to 200 or 100 to 400. Of course, each of these steps up is going to reduce quality, but it allows us to increase the shutter speed to get a usable image. After all, if your shutter speed's too slow to even get something sharp or to get the desired kind of compositional effect, then it doesn't matter what kind of dynamic range you have. It doesn't matter the sharpness. Nothing else matters. So ISO is kind of that last resort option. At least that's the way that I use it. I adjust my aperture and my shutter speed for my composition, and then I'll adjust my ISO if I can't get to the correct exposure with those two adjustments by itself. Otherwise, I leave it at ISO 100 all the time. Okay, so final recap. Our shutter speed is controlling the duration of time light is reaching the sensor. The aperture is controlling the amount of light reaching the sensor, and the ISO sensitivity is controlling, well, the overall sensitivity or the amount of light required from the sensor to get to your desired exposure.